Two major U.S. churches consider resolutions to boycott and divest from companies which do business in Israel. We ask if the campaign is one that helps or harms attempts to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu. This week, the United Methodist Church in the United States is considering a resolution to divest from some companies they say profit from the Israeli occupation. Those companies include Caterpillar, whose bulldozers are used by the Israeli military to demolish Palestinian homes, and Motorola Solutions, whose surveillance equipment is used in illegal settlements. It's part of a wider international movement called the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Campaign, or BDS. Critics say the initiative is a form of collective punishment against all Israelis, but its supporters, who were inspired by a similar movement against apartheid South Africa, disagree and say it's a non-violent means to pressure Israel to abide by international law. A few years ago, former President Jimmy Carter wrote a book called Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. Here's what he told our John Hendren about what he thought of the movement.
Well, I think it's been effective on a wide-ranging basis. Otherwise, the Israelis would not be so upset about it. And the BDS system, about which I have heard before you mentioned it, I think is gaining in strength. So the Israelis are legitimately concerned about it. I'm thankful for one thing, and that is that the Methodists and and Presbyterians are just considering three particular corporations. It's not a wide-ranging boycott. And these three are being criticized just because they provide direct help to the Israelis in destroying homes of the Palestinians and building the wall that is on Palestinian territory. So as long as it's a very narrowly focused effort to publicize the plight of the Palestinians, and probably won't have very much practical effect, I don't see that it'll do much damage. But it's up to the Methodists and Presbyterians to decide what they want to do.
So what impact will the Boycott, Divest and Sanctions campaign have? To discuss this, we're joined by MJ Rosenberg, former senior fellow at Media Matters Action Network, journalist and author Max Blumenthal, and the Reverend Walter Davis. He is a member of the Israel-Palestine Mission Network of the Presbyterian Church, which will also take up a BDS resolution in July. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And I guess the first question in this discussion is whether boycotts and disinvestment campaigns work, or do they harden attitudes and basically get very counterproductive. Let's take a look at the BDS campaign, which calls for military, diplomatic and economic sanctions against Israel. It's also organized a consumer boycott of Israeli companies or of international companies involved in Israeli policies they say violate Palestinian human rights and international law. There's also an academic boycott calling for an end to research, joint projects in collaboration with Israeli institutions, and the cultural boycott, encouraging artists not to perform in Israel, has achieved some notoriety. Rapper Snoop Dogg and singer Bono are among the artists who are honoring the boycott. Let me start with you, MJ Rosenberg. Do these sanctions work?
I think sanctions obviously work. If you look at the South African example, I don't think that this whole set of sanctions that you describe that would be directed against Israel would work. I think because it can work if you target an aspect of the system. But if you target the entire country, and in the case of Israel, if you're saying, no cultural contacts, no dealing with their universities, no business, no nothing, you're basically targeting the whole people, and you're basically saying the country shouldn't exist, and that's never going to succeed. I'm very much favor what President Carter talked about: a targeted boycott, divestment, sanction campaign only against those companies that are involved in facilitating the occupation of the West Bank or the blockade of Gaza, but not against Israel itself. I think there's a difference there.
Okay, let's go to Walt. Walt, you're from the Presbyterian Church, and the church is considering something similar to what the United Methodist Church is doing right now. Tell me why you think a boycott like that will work.
Well, what we're doing is first starting with an end of a long process. Our process is really one of corporate engagement with corporations that are profiting from violent behavior, violence done to others. And we've had an 8-year process in which we have had conversations with these corporations trying to get them to change their practices. And at the end of all of that long process, our last resort is to divest. So we are not calling for the boycotting of these organizations. We're calling for divestment of our share of profit making from those corporations. And I'm glad that MJ Rosenberg has approved of this. I'll tell all the commissioners that on the voice of and the authority of MJ Rosenberg, they should go ahead and divest.
Absolutely.
Max, I mean, the other question is, I mean, we heard President Carter there in that interview say that these sanctions are effective, that Israel is worried. Is Israel worried?
Israel's definitely worried. And Benjamin Netanyahu has identified the Goldstone threat, referring to Judge Goldstone's Goldstone report about the Israeli war crimes committed in Gaza as one of the key existential threats to Israel. They refer to it as delegitimization. Delegitimization is a code for BDS, and BDS has never been more on the public radar than now. One of the great successes of BDS is actually getting people within the Zionist fold to borrow aspects of it, to borrow the rhetoric of human rights, to borrow the rhetoric of democracy. BDS has scored a massive success on an educational and public relations level, and that's what really threatens Israel, besides the practical victories it scored on the ground and besides the victories that it's likely to score with the United Methodist Church.
So you and I have a really fundamental difference in that I believe that the Jewish state of Israel should continue to exist within the pre-67 borders, and you clearly believe that you don't favor that and want one state from the river, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea for everyone. I mean, I guess that's a fundamental difference between us, even though we agree on so many other things.
Yeah, I mean, I have enormous respect for MJ and his views and positions and experience. And I haven't called, I wouldn't myself specifically endorse one state, but we need to acknowledge the fact that Israel is a settler colonial state, that the settlements are not an exogenous feature of the state. They didn't drop from outer space. They are a projection of the nature of Israel. They're part of the DNA of Zionism. As Moshe Dayan said, there's not one part of Israel that isn't built on top of an Arab village. And Israel itself has a battery of discriminatory laws, of racist laws against its Arab citizens. And we also have to acknowledge that 70% of the residents of the Gaza Strip have refugee status. They are not allowed to return to their property and their homes inside Israel because they are not Jewish, because they don't have J-positive blood. And that, to me, is totally unacceptable. So what BDS is trying to do is to change the colonial relationship between Israeli Jews and Palestinians and make Israel into a normal country, just as it did with South Africa, so that Israel doesn't have to concoct schemes to back dictatorships next door to it, so that it can have treaties with them. Palestine can actually enjoy normal relations with its neighbors, and the conflict can come to a peaceful end.
I want to jump in and ask
go ahead.
MJ something here.
Yeah.
How you notice there's a series of articles that the Huffington Post is going to publish, 18 articles on liberal Zionism. And the question they're going to deal with is why a Jewish and democratic state is not an oxymoron. Now, can you explain why a Jewish state can also be a democratic state for all of its citizens?
I think that you can have a Jewish state that is a democracy if it's not occupying other people's land. The state of Israel was basically established after the United Nations vote of 1947, which is its birth certificate, which makes it legitimate. All countries, one could say, can you have a France? Can France be democratic if there are people who are living in France who don't have full democratic rights? That's obviously true. In every country in the world, there are some people who don't have full democratic rights, but they strive to achieve them. The United States, for instance.
Every French citizen has all of the rights of any other citizen.
Well, think of the United States, for instance. Did anyone say the United States was not a democratic country until 1965, when African Americans were given the right to vote?
Can I jump in?
But America evolved and changed thanks to.
1 moment, Max. I'll give you a chance right now.
You know, changed thanks to the Voting Rights Act and all the civil rights laws. In fact, I suppose you could say, by a true definition, the United States was not a democracy until 1965, and in fact, it may not even be now completely. But I think achieving democracy is a process. For me, the key thing, I'm a supporter of two states. I believe there has to be a Palestinian state in all of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, with full security, with secure borders, with all the rights of a state, right next door to Israel. Those two can evolve any way they want. Okay. But that's the place to start for me.
All right, MJ, let me give Max a chance to get his point.
Can I address that question? Because in order for Israel to be a Jewish and democratic state, it has to have a Jewish demographic majority. All of Israel's actions, its policies, are predicating on maintaining an ethnocracy that preserves the Jewish demographic majority. And the first thing Israel needed to do after Resolution 181, the partition, which Ben-Gurion said he would have rejected if the Arab Higher Committee accepted it, was massive ethnic cleansing in order to establish its Jewish demographic majority. And that ethnic cleansing continues today in the Negev Desert. It continues in the West Bank. And what Israel is trying to do is preserve the Jewish and democratic state by making the Palestinian refugees, the Palestinian diaspora, and the Palestinian citizens of Israel the victims of democracy. So this peculiar form of democracy, which is actually ethnocracy, requires ethnic cleansing and conflict. And the reason we don't have this going on in the United States, and the reason the United States was able to pass the Civil Rights Act in 1964, was because the United States completed its process of ethnic cleansing and put an end to Indian resistance. The Indian resistance, the indigenous resistance in Palestine is ongoing.
Right. I want to get back to the BDS campaign itself. Let's take a look at parts of the Methodist resolution that we're talking about. Now, the resolution here states that the biblical mandate to be peacemakers demands that we express our love of our Palestinian and Israeli neighbors, both in word and through nonviolent actions. The resolution goes on to say, divestment is not aimed at Israel itself, but at the occupation of land beyond its internationally recognized borders. As a nonviolent moral action, divestment seeks to strengthen the Church's support for the peoples of Israel and Palestine, whose future can only be secured through a just peace. Let's go to Walt. Walt, there are some who charge that the BDS campaign is actually anti-Israel, that it actually poses an existential threat to Israel.
Just apply that to South Africa. The BDS campaign aimed at South Africa was not aimed against the country itself. It was a game aimed against apartheid. And as soon as apartheid ended, then the reconciliation process was able to begin. So it's not an anti-Israel act. In fact, it's a very pro-Israel act, trying to rid Israel of a system that is a curse to Israel itself.
You know, Max, we often hear this comparison between Israel and South Africa. Is that a valid comparison? Is there, shall we say, some kind of moral equivalence here?
I don't know if there's a moral equivalence because South Africa created Bantustans to supply it with a workforce of menial labor that could be easily
racist state.
And they use these Bantustans, to exploit the labor, to exploit black African labor. Israel's created Bantustans and simply warehoused people there, surrounded them with walls and quarantined them. In the Gaza Strip, it prevents them from even exporting goods. Apartheid South Africa never bombed its Bantustans from the air with U.S. weapons, which the Methodist Church is seeking to divest from. So that's a key difference, is that according to Desmond Tutu, Israeli apartheid might actually be worse than South African apartheid in a lot of dimensions.
MJ, you want to respond to that? Israeli apartheid might be worse?
I think that Israeli apartheid might be worse, again, on the West Bank, in the West Bank, and also the blockade of Gaza, which people don't call that an occupation anymore. It's just entirely locked in. It's been turned into a ghetto, essentially.
Or an open-air prison.
An open-air prison, yeah. Right. So, it might be worse. I mean, I think that President Carter has said that it is worse in the West Bank. However, I don't think that the term applies to Israel itself. I don't think that that's apartheid at all. I think that, I am one of those people. I'm a Jew and I believe firmly that the Jewish people, like every other people in the world, are entitled to a spot of earth that's their own. And actually, that's one of the lessons of the 20th century, is that what happens to a people, to Jews, or to any people who don't have sovereignty over anything. I have to say that right now, the Palestinians would be in that category of people who have no sovereignty over anything and therefore no power. I would never want to see that happen to the Jews, which is why I support the existence of Israel within the 67 lines. So I think I'm all for using the definition of apartheid and for divestment and everything else relating to the occupation. I do not consider pre-67 Israel to be occupied. I consider it a legitimate state.
Where is pre-67 Israel? Because Israel has no borders.
Well, it has what is called the Green Line, which is essentially what Israel was before the morning of June 5th, 1967, is Israel.
I wonder about the two-state solution that you talk about, because Ahmed Correa, who's been a negotiator for probably my whole life for the Palestinian Authority and the PLO before that, has said that the two-state solution is dead. Yossi Beilin has called for the dissolution of the Palestinian Authority. He basically created it. But do you think that a two-state solution is even possible at this point, with 600,000 settlers in the West Bank, with over 40% of the Israeli army's officer corps as religious nationalists, with over 50% of Jewish youth saying they would refuse to evacuate settlements, with Ma'ale Adumim, this huge city, Israeli city in the West Bank? The master plan cuts the West Bank in half. Do you think it's even possible anymore? Or why bother entertaining this fantasy instead of talking about alternative solutions, including equality?
Well, I just want to say on that one point, I think that Israel would go back to the pre-67 lines if the United States of America demanded it. Remember President Eisenhower in 1956, Israel went to war with Egypt, invaded Egypt, took the Sinai Peninsula, and President Eisenhower said, get out.
There are domestic political concerns which mitigate against that.
Oh, there are.
That's another issue. Let me go to Walt.
I know.
Let me go to Walt. Walt, you were saying?
I hear a contradiction, MJ, in what you're saying. On the one hand, you're saying that Israel might have a civil rights revolution in which Palestinian citizens of Israel would gain equal rights, and that would make it a democracy. On the other hand, I hear you saying Jews deserve, because of the history and especially the Holocaust, a state of their own. And a state of their own is an ethnocracy where people with non-J blood do not have the same rights.
And they currently don't. And we constantly hear the rhetoric of destroying Israel from, MJ doesn't use this demagogic term, I don't think, but opponents of BDS always say, this will destroy Israel. Well, if equal rights will destroy Israel, what does that say about the state of Israel?
Well, I don't think the equal rights to the Palestinians, citizens of Israel, a pre-67 Israel will destroy Israel. What and how many years are we talking about? The birth rate right now, the Orthodox Jewish birth rate is far higher than the Palestinian birth rate inside Israel. So maybe we're talking about, what, 50 years, 60 years from now, when a Palestinian majority inside Israel would vote for another form of government? Well, who knows what's going to happen in 60 years? I think you start with the two-state solution, if at all possible, and I can see that might not be possible, and see how it might evolve. In the context of peace, anything is possible.
Okay, let's listen to some of the views of Israelis who live in Israel. They voiced their support for the Methodist efforts. Let's take a listen.
We understand that this is a decision about how the church will invest its own money, and we applaud the effort to make the church's actions consistent with its values. In view of this effort, we are asking you to support the Palestinian call for actions such as divestment from the Israeli occupation. We would like to stress that this form of divestment is far from being anti-Israeli or anti-Semitic.
Max, when we listen to those views there, I mean, are there people in the Israeli government who would be thinking, we have to be aware of what is happening right now and amend our policies, change them?
Apparently not. I mean, the Israeli government, and those are very brave Israelis, including my friend Ronnie Barkan from the BDS Within movement, which is very small and very marginal, but also very effective in convincing performers not to play in Tel Aviv, to send a message to Israelis that they're not normal until the occupation and discrimination ends. Now, instead of actually changing their policies, the Netanyahu government has invested millions and millions of dollars in what's known as hasbara, what Israelis call explanation, but what is in fact propaganda that really just looks ridiculous to the outside world. And their response is more propaganda, more of an aggressive PR effort to respond to BDS instead of actually changing what they do on the ground. Because Netanyahu, what he really thinks is that the BDS proponents are just anti-Semites who don't actually care about what's happening on the ground. They're not actually indignant about anything genuine. It stems from some sort of irrational hatred. And that really speaks to the irrational nature of the current government in Israel.
Okay, let me go to Walt. Walt, what would you like the ultimate aim of the BDS campaign? I mean, what would you like it to achieve?
Well, let me tell you what the Palestinians have articulated. The Kairos Palestine document has just mentioned economic actions to remove the occupation and to move the peace process forward. But the Palestinian civil society has articulated 3 specific goals. And I would address this question to Max and see how he would respond to those goals. The first goal is to end the occupation. The second goal is equal rights for all segments of the Palestinian people. That includes Palestinian-Israeli citizens, Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, East Jerusalem, everywhere, equal rights. And then the third one is the right of return. Now, I've heard many objections saying that would undo Israel as a state. How do you respond to that objection, Max?
Thanks for the question. I mean, that's a really important question because the first 2 points aren't always that controversial. I think MJ agrees with the first 2 points, but the third point about the right of return of refugees, which is enshrined in Resolution 194 in the UN, is controversial because it would essentially reverse Israel's Jewish demographic majority and end Israel's ethnocracy. And a lot of people say it would be a nightmare because they ascribe apparently endemically violent propensity to Palestinian refugees. Now, Israel was compelled to accept Resolution 194 as a condition for its acceptance to the General Assembly in the United Nations. Harry Truman called for a resolution to the refugee crisis, demanded that Ben-Gurion allow the refugees to come back. The special diplomat sent to resolve the crisis in 1948, Volky Bernadotte, who had rescued tens of thousands of Jews in World War II during the Holocaust, came to do the same for the Palestinian refugees, and he was assassinated by the Zionist Stern Gang. So Israel has done everything in its ability to keep these Palestinians, millions of them, warehoused in squalid refugee camps. And I visited these camps in Lebanon, where they're actually barred from 74 professions inside Lebanon. And I can't go there and tell a Palestinian father that his children shouldn't be able to return to historic Palestine, so I can continue to take advantage of the one-way right of return that Israel has on the books.
We are going to have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us, Max Blumenthal, MJ Rosenberg, and the Reverend Walter Davis. And that is it from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And of course, we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for joining us.